Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Shortcut U podcast. This time I sit down with Dr. Eric Trexler, who has both a bachelor's and a master's degree in exercise science, as well as a Ph.D. in human movement science. And Dr. Trexler is also currently conducting research in metabolism. In addition to his educational background, he has experience competing in pro drug free bodybuilding as well as powerlifting. And he also has a bunch of experience coaching athletes as well as lay people who are looking to reach their health and fitness goals. In this episode, though, we don't talk much about specific health and fitness topics. Rather, we spend most of our time talking about research statistics and how to interpret research. I think this topic is really interesting and really valuable for anybody who's looking to be able to read through research themselves and draw their own conclusions, as well as anyone who's interested in the behind the scenes work when it comes to research and understanding the concept or system of science itself. And lastly, I think that this episode and the content within will be really valuable for anybody who's looking to better navigate the world of health and fitness and research based recommendations on social media. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Eric Trexler. One of the things I was really interested in talking to you about is understanding like research statistics and then also interpreting research results. And so I know what I want to talk about. It might take me a little bit to explain it, so just bear with me here.
Sure. Yeah.
I was just thinking back to like in the past couple of years, a little background on me. I was a health science major in undergrad and then took a couple gap years, and I'm starting med school this upcoming month. And for the past couple of years, I've had a blog where I put out like health and fitness content, and it's been more kind of research geared for the past maybe 2 years. Yeah. For a little bit, I was kind of off in limbo, not really knowing what I wanted to make content about. But I kind of gradually realized how much I was missing behind the scenes, or how much I didn't understand in terms of how we actually reach conclusions. So like of course I knew like there must have been experiments done to reveal like things we know to be true in health and fitness and stuff like that. But I guess everything for me was just like read it in the textbook and that is fact. I didn't realize that there was this whole world behind that created the confidence in what we read in the textbook. And so I feel like that's probably pretty common for a lot of people. And what's funny is since like middle school or even high school, I was really big into health and fitness stuff, mostly for sports. And so people kind of knew me as like someone who took nutrition really seriously and training really seriously. And they would have thought that I knew a lot about what I was talking about. And I guess per the typical Dunning-Kruger effect, I like gradually realized I knew almost nothing about what I was talking about. And so that's the first thing I kind of want to unveil is for this to be a good, I guess, episode for anyone like me or probably like you. I'll get to asking you about this in a second, like years ago, who really wants to understand and have like accurate conclusions and understand the tools for reaching those conclusions. And the second piece, the statistical piece, is that I realized it might be, you might have experienced this also, is that, for example, if I talk to somebody about muscle hypertrophy, like I'm certainly no expert, but I've read enough to understand kind of processes from like the cell all the way up to what we do training in the gym. If someone's really wants to understand the concept of what like muscle hypertrophy actually is, I realize I need to first make sure they understand what DNA is, what gene expression is, and muscle protein synthesis. And pretty much they need to be able to speak this other kind of language of cell biology or physiology, depending on the topic. And when it comes to understanding research findings, like I was talking about before, to me, understanding statistics and statistical analyses is like that other kind of hidden language that you need to know a little bit or have like some baseline fluency to actually even understand how to interpret the research. Does that make sense, or does that jive with you at all?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I mean, when I was working on my Ph.D. and even in my master's program, interacting with folks at conferences around the country in the field, it was pretty apparent to me early on that a lot of folks really embraced statistics as part of their training in this field, and other folks kind of reluctantly accepted that a minimum level of proficiency would be necessary. But they really, you had to kind of twist their arm and drag them through it. And they really resented the fact that it was happening. And to me, I always just found that to be so surprising and so counterintuitive, because I would talk to these folks and I would say, well, what are you in your degree program for? And at the PhD level, people say, well, I want to do science and publish this research and disseminate findings. I'm going to say, yeah, but how are you going to know what you found? And they're like, well, by the results. And but what do you mean exactly? Like every conclusion you make in your papers in our field, which is very quantitatively driven, every single claim that you make in your papers, every conclusion you draw from your entire body of work from the age of 28 to 78 is going to be based most likely on a statistical test. And if you are reluctant to embrace understanding that test, to me, that's just a contradiction that I could never wrap my head around. The idea that you will literally base your entire life's work on these tests, but say, yeah, but I kind of don't like them and they're kind of not all that necessary, and I'll just kind of do the bare minimum. I can never wrap my head around that. And that's why early on I decided, okay, if stats are part of the game, and I mean, like as a reviewer, I review papers for journals. If someone submits a paper and they make a claim in it that is not supported by the statistics, rejected, done. Like you literally can't. So for me, I just couldn't really reconcile that discrepancy between every decision I make must be reinforced by statistical analysis, but also I'm going to go about my whole career as if statistical analysis is kind of unnecessary, but I'm going through the motions anyway. So yeah, definitely early in my career, I had some of the same realizations that you described, kind of indicating like, hey, there's a lot more to be learned here. And it would be extremely beneficial for me to go ahead and dive into that and figure it out sooner rather than later. And that has definitely been my experience. But unfortunately, you kind of, as you start doing that, you definitely feel more competent, more proficient, more confident in the work that you're doing. But then you start to realize that it's a little bit like pulling the kind of loose string on the sweater. And the more that you pull, the more you're like, whoa, there's kind of a lot more here than I thought. So yeah, the stuff that you initially feel like you need to tackle and understand is more like the tip of the iceberg. And the deeper you go, the more you realize, wow, there's some serious stuff kind of hidden underneath the surface here.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like one thing that can kind of highlight my experience with this is I just remember back, like maybe it was middle school, high school, college, or whatever. I remember like having an argument with a friend or something, or debate about X, Y, or Z. Be like, oh, well, let's look it up. And then we'll just type it into Google. And the first thing that shows up, we click on that. And whatever that abstract says, or like probably just the first sentence, whatever the first sentence says, is like fact, done deal, completely case closed. And I don't know, I guess that just like highlights again how much I was missing that goes on behind the scenes. And even now, like I'd like to think I have a little bit of the 80-20, maybe even a little bit more of understanding how to interpret stuff. But when I read through research papers, there are so many words that I'm reading over in the statistical analysis piece of the method section that are really just going in one ear and out the other. Like I feel like I understand like p-values and relative versus absolute risk and stuff like that maybe we'll get into, that I have enough confidence that I can maybe read through stuff and understand it. I'll always default back to like people like yourself if it's like health and fitness stuff, where I'll make sure I'm not going completely opposite of what everyone else is saying and make sure I'm not missing anything. But yeah, it's just like you were saying, there's just so much that I keep unpeeling, like the classic onion analogy that is, yeah, just like you were saying, the string on the sweater. And one thing I noticed about you is, I mean, like you were saying, PhDs in general should have some baseline competence in statistics and understanding research. One of the reasons I reached out to you in particular is when I listened to you on the Iron Culture podcast, several times repeatedly, Dr. Helms, who also has a PhD and presumably has a great understanding of statistics and interpreting research and does research himself, will often kick things over to you and kind of identify you as like the statistics man yourself. So what is it was there any specific education you had in addition to your PhD, or any classes in particular that kind of give you that extra competence or expertise in statistics?
I don't know. I think I just took a liking to it and found it to be fascinating. So I would spend more time than was necessary trying to figure out some of the nuances. So the backbone of my statistics education came from formal coursework. Took several stat courses ranging from undergrad to multiple courses at the PhD level. But yeah, I feel like I just kind of took a liking to it. And so I would often dig a little deeper and say, oh, well, I could do this like a really superficial way, but I'm curious to see how I can explore this further. And I will personally credit, uh, for kind of inspiring that curiosity. I think getting in, getting comfortable with R as a statistical software early in my career, I think was really beneficial because a lot of kind of basic statistical softwares, they are they really confine you to a narrow range of procedures, and you just kind of are following along the track like you're on a train. Whereas with R, you can really go off road. You can get out in the mud and kind of figure out what's going on and really manipulate all these different elements of the analysis in a way. When I say manipulate, that sounds nefarious, but for example, I create a model and I know that there is some error. It's not going to be perfectly predictive of the data, but using R was the first time that I said, instead of just looking at, I'll do a Shapiro-Wilk test and see if my, residuals are normally distributed or not. I'd say, forget that. I want to look at them. I want to go into the model, pull them out, plot them, and actually, dig deeper and look at different types of residuals. And so when you start using a software that has this really broad range of procedures that you can complete, you feel like there are fewer guardrails and there's more opportunity to explore the data and really embrace different elements of the data. So yeah, I think getting involved with R was a huge part of it because it made the whole process a little bit more interesting and exciting. And I had a great roommate for most of grad school, who we would push each other and see who could do the weirdest thing in our software, like who could really push the envelope. So I remember at one point I had made someone a birthday card just using the graphical elements of our software. And then I think I finally tapped out and gave up when he texted me from R on my phone. And I was like, okay, you got me there. But yeah, it's just it was a process of getting the basics through coursework, but really exploring and kind of not as an act of discipline, but as an act of joyful discovery, kind of digging deeper every time I did a paper or an analysis and saying, yeah, I understand like the bare bones, most basic analysis I could do, but how do I take every paper as an opportunity to reinforce and slightly expand my skill set as appropriate, obviously.
Gotcha. Cool. Before we go on, do you have like a time limit or any time you want to make sure I finish by?
Not really, no.
Okay, cool. So I have kind of a list of terms just to bring up that we can talk about that are like kind of basic, bare bones, like I was saying, the 80-20. If you want to go further in depth or bring anything up that you think is like really valuable for someone trying to understand this stuff from maybe more of a beginner standpoint, feel free to go off on whatever tangents you want. The first thing I have written down is just the scientific method, which I know is really broad, but can you outline maybe like what it actually looks like approaching a question through research and creating the hypothesis? And then maybe the next thing I have is study design hierarchy. So maybe how things move from like your first hypothesis, where you start there with mechanistic studies, rodent models, observational studies, things like that, and how things maybe flow, and what you're thinking of from the perspective of the actual researcher behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, scientific method, generally speaking, is just kind of a descriptive term for a very systematic and iterative method of, I would say, learning more about the world around us, right? So it's really easy to use fitness as an example, because a lot of folks get into fitness before they start caring about the science of fitness. So, for example, you start training, and at first it's going great because everything goes great for the most part. When you first start training, you start running into some challenges, some questions, and a lot of times, that's where people say, okay, I'm going to lean on someone with more expertise or something like that. But my path was, okay, I have run into some challenges, some questions, things like that. And I asked 3 people I trust, and all 3 gave me different answers, right? Like mutually exclusive answers, right? They cannot all, there's no way to kind of reconcile this and say, well, they're basically saying the same thing. I mean, there are truly divergent perspectives here. So we've kind of identified a problem based on observations of the world around us. And so, when I got into grad school, it was really fun because it was an opportunity to say, okay, we've got a problem statement. Now we can formulate a hypothesis, design a study to directly test that hypothesis, look at the results of that testing, and basically update our understanding of that topic in question. And almost always what you find is you are looking for a 100% resolution where every question is answered in a completely satisfactory way. But usually what happens is you answer part of the question, but you start to say, well, based on this, now I'm having additional questions that are kind of forming, and it kind of goes from there. So it's this building process of making observations, identifying problems or questions, formulating a hypothesis about those problems or questions, testing those, getting more data, observing, and kind of going throughout that process. And so when it comes to different types of research or different types of study designs, it's interesting because people like to lay that out as if it's a very linear thing. And they might say, I don't even know the most common direction that people will go with it. But for example, they might say, we observe this thing in totally observational epidemiological evidence in humans. And we say, hey, maybe that matters. Let's do a study in rodents, for example, or fruit flies, to try to understand why that might be, to identify some type of mechanism. If we then identify a plausible mechanism that could make sense in humans, to the extent that it's ethical to do so, we may then run a more robust, formal study in humans where we're actually experimentally changing variables to see if we can elicit the response that we're going for, right? So sometimes people will kind of portray it in that particular flow. Other times people will switch up the flow a little bit and say, we've been studying these mice and we observed this very interesting thing that their cells do. I wonder if that happens in humans before we run an expensive, potentially dangerous trial. Let's see if we can find glimpses of this at, big population level observational data. And if so, now we have reason to believe that this little mechanism we found here may indeed translate to something clinically relevant for humans. And therefore, we feel that it would be valuable to put the time and resources into running a larger human trial on the matter. So sometimes people will paint it as one of these linear processes, but it's really not. Basically what you have is a huge number of people that are constantly cranking out this basic mechanistic research, and a huge number of people that are cranking out this observational epidemiological type research, and a huge number of people that are reading all that stuff and designing trials as they go. And so it creates this giant cyclical kind of web where it's multi-directional ideas bouncing across from one type of research to the other. And so all those different elements kind of work in unison to have this giant scientific method continuously kind of slowly moving forward like a big snowball. And every now and then, the snowball keeps building and building and building as we learn more, create more observations. We start to go from a big picture idea to a really, refined understanding of this particular concept or theory. And then, like I said, every now and then there is a dramatic finding that turns the entire thing on its head. And we say, whoa, it's not just, it's not necessarily that every single thing we did was wrong along the way, but we have been asking fundamentally flawed questions. And therefore, our observations that we've been getting have not really been bringing us closer to the real truth. And the term people use for that type of finding is, they often say it's paradigm shifting. It basically says, hey, we were going down this trajectory and we really thought we were developing a good understanding, but we need to slam on the brakes because of this new finding. Once we do some replication, confirm that it's actually a legitimate finding, but this really does change everything. And we really need to kind of start from square one with this new working model, this new understanding of how things work. So that doesn't happen often, but it does happen from time to time. And when it happens in like the field of physics, for example, it's like earth shattering. It's like, hey, we discovered like a new force or something. But that tends not to happen as much. I would say in the applied sciences, the true paradigm shifts are few and far between.
Gotcha. And so, with that kind of snowball idea you were talking about, it seems like, and this isn't the case with a lot of areas, but sometimes everything kind of lines up and the snowball just keeps getting bigger and bigger and things get clearer and clearer. And eventually we establish kind of the paradigm you're talking about where it's just kind of understood that X is X or this is that. We've come to an agreement on what the truth is, quote unquote. But science being probabilistic, technically there's always some amount of doubt. And sometimes, like you described, there's a paradigm shift that shows us, everything we once thought, like you said, we were way off, or we were asking the wrong types of questions. Can you describe kind of how you think of things in terms of consensus that way, and how we reach the point where we're like, okay, this is enough. We've done tons of studies, and sure, maybe we'll still be doing studies on the fringes, getting more and more details, but we can kind of accept that this is accurate. And like you mentioned physics, for example, I think that's a great example because now moving forward, as I understand it, I'm not like a huge physics buff, but moving forward, trying to understand things deeper than like the physics realm, they'll start off with, okay, if we accept X, Y, and Z as true, because those things over the years, like gravity, for example, or something like that, have just really held up. And so we can move forward kind of assuming that they're accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Whenever we are kind of embarking on these lines of research, especially things that are less tangible, less easy to kind of, see at the macro level, we do have to sign up for a lot of assumptions before we can even pose a question. We have to say, given X, Y, and Z, here are the following questions that we aim to answer. And usually with a paradigm shift, what happens is we find out that every question we've been asking for the last 30 years in this field has started with given X, Y, and Z, and then the question, and we find out X, Y, and or Z is not true. And then you say, oh crap, well, that was kind of the foundational assumption for most of what we've been doing in this area. But can you remind me what the question was again?
Just like how things
Consensus,
come together
right?
to reach a consensus.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on the field very much, but I can say in a very applied field or a very clinically oriented field, generally takes the form of you get several different studies from different labs finding similar things using the highest level of evidence available, and At that point, you can usually put together meta-analyses that take a fairly unbiased look at the entire body of literature once there is a substantial body of literature, meaning a meaningful number of studies published on the topic. You start to get some of these meta-analyses coming out or systematic reviews. You start to get reputable organizations who really lead their field, who will then say, we as this reputable body that has power and authority and influence in this field of practice have come together to weigh this evidence, and we believe the following to be true. And in some cases, you'll even see for professions that involve licensure, you'll see that they will then make it basically legally necessary to at least practice in compliance with this consensus. And that's in the vast majority of cases a very good thing. You don't want to go in to get a surgery and find out after the fact that your surgeon's like, yeah, I'm not really into germ theory, so I didn't, wash my hands or sanitize my instruments. Like, you kind of want to make sure that there's a basic set of standards within, some of these fields, especially when it comes to healthcare. But yeah, that's usually how a consensus forms. And like I said, when it comes to, I use the term the best evidence available, right? Because for a lot of fitness questions, we can do reasonably powered, reasonably long, randomized controlled trials and do that in an ethical way and understand how an intervention works. But I'm very comfortable with the consensus opinion that cigarette smoking is bad for your lungs. You're not going to get a lot of randomized controlled trials that kind of play that out over decades, but I think the preponderance of the evidence by far would indicate that you dramatically increase your risk of lung cancer, emphysema, a variety of lung conditions by smoking, particularly smoking large amounts over long durations of time, right? But the level of evidence or the type of evidence used there is inherently going to be different, because it's unethical to say, we believe that this is going to have a severe impact on your longevity and health. How would you like to flip a coin and figure out if you're in the cigarette group or not? It's just not something you can do.
Right. So you talked about the kind of quality of evidence being the best evidence. Then you also talked about having a large enough body of evidence. And I want to talk about both. First, I guess, can you describe your framework, or like how people think of having enough studies that we can start to build confidence? Because I think the perspective of like a layperson will be completely different. Or I think people would be shocked to understand or hear what a lot of studies means through the perspective of a researcher. I remember I talked to Dr. Milo Wolf earlier this year about lengthened partials and research on range of motion. And while I was preparing, I read through a lot of the studies looking at lengthened partials versus full range of motion, and it seemed like pretty strong evidence to me. But then I remember hearing him say, like, we don't have that many studies yet. We only have like whatever it was, 6 or 7 studies, and since then more have come out. But I just remember, I think that was the first time I really recognized what quantity or what a large body of evidence on a given topic really was. And I think most people, like I was saying before, if you just look up whatever question you have, one study pops up, it seems like that is definitive. I think people would be surprised, as I was, to kind of change that perspective to what really is a small body of evidence to kind of moderate size to a large body of evidence in terms of study number.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the type of evidence that meets your threshold. And what I mean by that is every now and then there's these topics that come up that get really popular, and you find that there's like 4 actual studies on the topic with original data, and then like 9 reviews of those 4 studies. And it's just people talking about this very small body of evidence. But that doesn't mean that now there's, I think the numbers I used were 9 and 4. It doesn't mean that now there's 13 studies on it just because there's 13 papers, right? You start to find that people are really stretching the small amount of data into a bunch of commentary and interpretation. So how much is enough? It depends usually on the standards of the field. In my opinion, it depends on the stakes of the question as well. So let's be honest, there's certain research questions in, especially the fitness realm, where the stakes are just incredibly low. They're just looking for these tiny effect sizes that would only be relevant if you were, elite world-class athlete looking for the just smallest advantage possible. And the evidence, the studies aren't done in that population. So in many cases, we don't even know with certainty if it's going to translate to them. We're kind of, the Olympics are going on right now. Sometimes we're looking for effect sizes that would only matter to a sprinter who's going to make the finals. And every single study on it is done in people who, can't run a mile in under 20 minutes, right? So it's like, I don't know if that's really strong evidence, even if we get, 25 of those for that particular application. So how much is enough depends on the stakes, depends on the quality of the studies, because at the end of the day, you can't take 11 really poorly designed studies and say, I bet that makes about 2 good ones. It doesn't work that way. Quality matters. It'd be like if you're not to act like it's some kind of inspired art to do research. It's very much a science, more so than an art. But it's like saying, listen, I suck at writing songs, but if I give you like 13 terrible songs, that's got to be as good as having like one hit, right? And it's like, no, when you write a hit, something special has come together. It's been done well and it's been done right, and it meets the listener at the right moment in time, right? If you wrote something that was a hit in 1993 and you released it today, it would not become a hit today, most likely, because it was all off, right? So all of that is to say, like, you can't just go by volume. You have to also go by quality, because, like I said, 11 terrible studies does not equate to 2 good ones. So, yeah, it's tough to say in a generalizable sense, but ideally, assuming that the research is reasonably decent quality and that there's a typical range between fairly good studies and fairly poor studies, a lot of times I'd love to see ideally at least like a couple dozen studies on a topic before I feel like I have a really good sense of before I really feel like I have my finger on the pulse of that topic.
And does consistency in terms of outcome play into that at all? Like you have 20 studies, all of them pretty much saying the same thing versus 20 studies, 15 saying one thing and then 5 saying the other. Is that something you take into account?
Definitely. And that's why meta-analyses are such a useful tool. A lot of times people will say they're at the highest level of the hierarchy of evidence, the strongest level of evidence, the lowest potential for bias, all these different superlatives talking up their superiority. And they're a wonderful tool. I love meta-analyses. But yeah, one of the reasons that people heap all this praise on meta-analyses is because you can get this beautiful funnel plot. And to me, I think it's a crime that when exercise science and sport nutrition started getting into funnel plots, or started getting into doing a lot of meta-analyses, they really took off in the last like 10 years or so. No one appreciated funnel plots. People were not putting them in their papers, which to me is insane. I find it to be the most informative element of the typical meta-analysis. With a funnel plot, that's where you start to make sense of, okay, we got this one study that showed a huge positive effect. We got this other study that actually showed a sizable negative effect. We got these other studies that show virtually no effect either way. The funnel plot literally plots them out in the shape of an upside down funnel. So it should be looking like a triangle. And you can make sense of, okay, so what is the typical effect in this body of literature? What seems to be that central point of this upside down funnel? Does there seem to be an acceptable level of symmetry in this funnel? If not, now you're starting to say, okay, we've got all these little studies with huge positive effect sizes, but there's no little studies with huge effect sizes on the other side of the mean outcome. And you start to say, okay, in that case, statistically speaking, the most likely scenario is that we are overestimating the effect size here. There should be symmetry in this funnel plot. And if there isn't, that gives us a good explanation of what could be going on. Now, every now and then, you may find a funnel plot where you see that there's not asymmetry, but there's just kind of these two clusters. There's like really good studies over here, really crappy studies over here in terms of the effect, really positive effect, really negative effect, and not a ton going on in the middle. And it starts to give you the impression, it's almost like we're estimating two different effect sizes within this funnel plot. And perhaps you go in to that meta-analysis and you say, let's look at the heterogeneity statistics. And you find out there's a lot of heterogeneity between studies, indicating some of these studies don't really seem to be honing in on the same thing, the same value, the same estimate. And so then you want to do some tests statistically to figure out why that might be. And so, for example, maybe you find that this intervention, whatever it is, works really well in trained people and doesn't do anything in untrained people. And you say, okay, now we're seeing why there was this study everyone talks about with a positive effect, but this other one that everyone talks about with a negative effect. You can say, okay, well, this was in trained, this was in untrained, or vice versa. Maybe there's a sex difference. Maybe these studies have different results based on the dose that was provided, if it's something that can be easily quantified. So a meta-analysis is such a powerful tool because you don't just it's not like some kind of black box, so to speak, where you jam all the studies in and it kicks out one number, which is the average effect. Sometimes people interpret them that way, but that is a sin of the highest order, in my opinion. A meta-analysis does so much more than that. It tells you about the heterogeneity, the variance in the type of estimates that we get, and it allows you to explore what is underlying this heterogeneity or variance in the type of estimates that we get. So when you find a body of literature where there are a few dozen studies published, that is where you say, okay, we really have an opportunity here with a meta-analysis to answer a lot of questions about how, when, where, and why this intervention does or does not work.
Yeah. So you talked about meta-analysis sitting kind of at the top of the design hierarchy, being viewed at least traditionally kind of as the most useful, or maybe the final say. You could think of it that way. And if we go back to what we were talking about before with the snowball, and if all the arrows are pointing in the same direction, to me, study design hierarchy really just guides us into what type of study we're going to be doing next. And if we look at a situation where all the direction or all the arrows aren't pointing in the same direction, then I think study design hierarchy guides us in another way in terms of interpreting what data to follow. For example, if we've gone all the way up, we've done mechanistic study, rodent models, we've done observational studies, we've also done randomized controlled trials, we've done meta-analyses, there are a bunch of reviews. Now, if everything's not pointing in the same direction, now we look at study design hierarchy to determine maybe where we go from here with the next study still, and also which studies do we want to weight, how much do we want to weight each study design and whatnot. Can you describe maybe a traditional view of how you would look at a body of evidence and looking at the strengths and weaknesses of different designs, and then maybe in different contexts, whether or not that traditional view of the latter of which studies are more valuable than others, how that might change? I have a couple of examples maybe that I can throw at you, but first, just maybe an outline.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, there's this evidence hierarchy, and the kind of traditional view is that when there is a discrepancy where one level of evidence is saying, for example, in the broadest terms possible, this intervention's good, and the other one is saying this intervention doesn't work or even is bad, usually you're going to default or defer to the higher level of evidence on that hierarchy. For example, I've got several well-conducted randomized controlled trials telling me that this thing doesn't work in humans, but I've got 13 mouse studies indicating that this does work in mice. a very intuitive assumption there, which you'd want to dig in deeper to confirm, is however this is working in mice, this mechanism doesn't seem to actually be translating over to humans living in real world conditions, right? And so you'd say, hey, you can give me 30 more studies showing that this works in mice, but until we start to see it working in humans, that doesn't really do me a lot of good unless I happen to have pet mice that I really care for and I want to, do this intervention for them. Now, having said that, there are sometimes interesting debates that push back on that conventional wisdom where, for example, someone might argue that I'll give concrete examples to kind of make the point. There's two main themes where these arguments get interesting. One is, for example, in the world of nutrition, people say it's so hard to actually control what humans eat. It's very easy to control what animals in a lab eat. And therefore, some people will say, I actually put more stock in controlled rodent feeding studies than I do in observational human nutrition studies, because I don't think humans are good enough at knowing and honestly reporting what they actually eat. At the bare minimum, I feel like with rodents, I know exactly what they eat and when and how it was prepared and all that stuff. So I've seen some people who will make that type of argument. I've also seen some people who, this is not an argument that I think is made well in most cases, but I've seen examples where maybe you have a tightly controlled metabolic ward nutrition study, right? And what I mean by that is the participants are literally living in the location of this study. They'll like check into a research hospital and live there for the duration of the study. Very difficult study to do, very atypical. They happen, but man, what an investment of resources, what a burden to participants. So they will literally cook every meal you consume, and they will watch you eat them, and they will weigh the food that you left on your plate. It is meticulously controlled and managed and all that stuff. And so every now and then people will see something that works there, but maybe it doesn't work in these kind of observational settings where people are actually going about their normal day-to-day life. And so sometimes people will say, okay, I get that it works in this perfect kind of artificial scenario where human adherence is of no consequence. There is no question about it. Adherence is perfect always and will always be. But then when you try to translate that out to a real person living in the real world who marks celebrations and holidays with food and is fighting against hunger and has a pantry and a refrigerator full of food that they can access many times throughout the day, maybe I don't really care if this intervention works in a metabolic ward, because no one is going to actually implement it and stick with it for a meaningful amount of time in the real world. So every now and then you will see people who make arguments that say, no, we need to push further down the evidence hierarchy for a particular specific reason that is usually highly related to either the nature of the intervention or the degree to which the intervention has what we call ecological validity, or, a high probability of translation, successful translation to the real world and free living individuals.
Right. Just touching on the kind of metabolic ward studies you were talking about, you might appreciate this. I was actually talking about this with the last guest I had, is that I was reading through papers on pretty much looking at lean body mass and how it's affected during weight loss. And there were these two studies, maybe from like the 1980s, maybe 1990s or something. And compared to studies today, they were just way more controlled in that they had identical twins go to a metabolic ward research facility, and for 100 days they lived there, and two researchers watched every single thing that they ate and measured everything out. And I don't know, it was just like, compared to what you read today, that was like the first time I'd really read a paper that was like that controlled. And going off of kind of the topic of control, you talked about going down the hierarchy. I think for anyone who even dips their toes into like health and fitness content online that has anything to do with research is probably familiar now with the idea of correlation doesn't equal causation when looking at observational studies. And from one perspective, I think this is probably good because it tells me that maybe years ago, this wasn't quite as much of common knowledge, and so people would overinterpret observational studies. But at the same time, now I think in some ways we've shifted, or maybe like the general public has shifted a little bit, in that they completely throw observational research out the window and look at randomized controlled trials as these perfect studies, similar to what we just talked about, where they have like perfect control. And one thing I noticed, I was writing kind of a blog series just talking about the very, very basic details of different study designs. Like, what is an observational study? Limitations, strengths, randomized controlled trials, same thing. And when I got to the randomized controlled trials, I was just kind of playing around with this idea that you just described of there's always a trade-off between control and ecological validity. For anyone listening who doesn't know what I mean, it's ecological validity is just what you described. It's how things translate into practice, into real world circumstances. And so, like one example that came to mind for me when I was thinking about the conversation we were going to have is diet and cardiovascular disease. So, for example, saturated fat consumption in observational studies tends to be associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And also there are mechanistic studies or maybe mechanistic theory about the ApoB model of atherosclerosis and how increased concentration of lipoproteins or lipoproteins of the LDL lineage will increase your risk of developing atherosclerosis. But then when we look at randomized controlled trials, for example, if you, based on what I've read, I haven't read all of it, if you just looked at the randomized controlled trials, it might not seem so clear that eating a ton of saturated fat is actually that bad for you. And so looking at the traditional hierarchy, you might say, okay, well, randomized controlled trials didn't confirm it. You shouldn't really be worried about your saturated fat consumption. But in this example, it's really difficult to measure, first, like you were talking about, how much saturated fat people are actually consuming. And then when it comes to something like cardiovascular disease, something that develops over, maybe decades, it's really hard to track these individuals in a controlled manner for that duration of time, even if we could track them very well. And so in this case, it seems to me like, sure, observational studies, they aren't as well controlled, but they can follow a lot more individuals, and they can follow those individuals a lot longer, particularly in this case, long enough to actually see the difference in outcomes. Does that kind of jive with what you were talking about with going down the observational hierarchy or the design hierarchy at all?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you really have to think, like, what is the outcome of interest here? And in what study design can we actually assess that effectively? So the time course of exposure and the time course of, for example, disease progression, that stuff really matters for what type of design is going to be ideal. If you're talking about a disease that develops over a multiple decade time horizon or time course, a 6-week study is probably not going to satisfy anyone unless you have identified a mechanism that is very rapidly responsive, and those rapid responses are predictive of long-term responses. And there is basically universal acceptance that biomarker is, that mechanistic biomarker is beyond reproach, a almost singular, strong, powerful driver of the disease state in question. So that doesn't happen a lot. And even when it does happen, people still hate it and get in arguments about it anyway. So, there's still a lot of debate about stuff that I considered fairly settled science in the realm of blood lipids. But yeah, it's always interesting to see how people work through some of these different study designs. And you know, it's really fascinating to see when people get really dug in on their favorite theory. It's interesting to see. You can already start to see how these trade-offs, debates, pros and cons, how they start to open up these avenues for disagreement, right? Um, so yeah, like you'll have people who there will be a randomized controlled trial which shows just terrible changes in blood lipids, right? And someone who really likes that diet will say, yeah, LDL went through the roof and total cholesterol went through the roof, but uh, HDL went up a small amount and triglycerides are low. And it's like, yeah, but that LDL response is terrible, and the ApoB response is terrible. And you'll also see, like, one of the things back like 10 years ago, 10 to 15, I guess, at this point, ketogenic diets were getting really big in the sport and lifting world. They were all the rage. And, a lot of people were even advocating for them in like pretty glycolytic activities. So sporting activities that require pretty high reliance on carbohydrate metabolism for optimal fuel production. Because at the end of the day, some sports you just got to create ATP very quickly, and you got to have carbs to do it. And there were a lot of people who kept just moving the goalpost and saying, well, yeah, that was an 8-week randomized controlled trial where keto totally impaired performance in this type of activity. But if it had been 10 weeks, they would have adapted and they would have been just fine. And then they did a 10-week study and they say, well, actually, it's probably more like 12 weeks that you need to really adapt. And then you get there. So there's always going to be some of this wiggle room in these studies, because research can take so many different formats and be interpreted in so many different ways. But, I also want to acknowledge, as we've talked about stronger forms of evidence versus weaker, we've talked about, how you weigh them against each other. Sometimes I think there's a lot of misconceptions about certain forms of evidence being more important than others. And I think the whole, getting all the way back to the scientific method, the whole thing works because we've got these different angles that we can look at questions and problems through. And one of the reasons that I am so happy that I decided to invest in statistical training earlier in my career is that it opens a lot of opportunities to embrace all these different elements of scientific inquiry. If you have a very poor statistics background, but you've received very high quality laboratory training, you may very well be in a great position to do mechanistic research, but it may be extremely difficult for you to interpret observational research that uses more complex mathematical modeling, or statistical modeling, I should say. And I feel really fortunate that in my training, I've had times where I've gotten the best of each world, in my opinion, where I've gotten really good training on lab-based methods and also very good training in statistics, which is fantastic because now when I show up to a research problem with my toolbox, I don't look in it and see only a hammer or only a screwdriver. The question is, what's the best tool that we can use with the resources available to make meaningful, to develop and create new meaningful insights about this research question. Sometimes you reach for the hammer, sometimes you reach for the screwdriver, sometimes you reach for the saw. And so that's why, at this stage in my career, I've got multiple papers that are out in peer review or just about to get submitted. One is purely observational, just straight up epidemiology. One is a meta-analysis. There's always randomized controlled trials and interventions working their way through. And so every paper I do these days has a completely different statistical approach, which allows you to kind of leverage all these different valuable tools in the scientific process. And I think they all play a really important role.
What you talked about with somebody being really well-versed in the lab, then maybe not being as well-versed in observational studies and having kind of a mismatch of application there, reminded me of, I was doing a deep dive into some research on zinc supplementation, particularly zinc lozenges, and whether or not they're useful for the common cold. And the data is kind of split, and I won't get into it too much, but my point I want to make is one of the researchers who was kind of a proponent of using them came out with a review that was like, well, actually, if you apply this model, this statistical model across the randomized controlled trials, you'll see that it actually shows that they are beneficial. And then I saw a response paper that was somebody, I think, who was involved in economics. And they were like, you took this statistical model that's designed to model X, Y, or Z in economics, and actually it shouldn't be applied the way you're applying it. It's only supposed to be applied under these specific criteria or this specific context. But yeah, I just found that interesting. And maybe moving on with looking at different study designs, going back to correlation doesn't equal causation, can you explain why there is kind of the traditional bias is to favor randomized controlled trials over observational studies? Why observational studies are inherently, well, just, I guess, what are their limitations, just like any other study design?
Yeah, in observational studies, you are essentially taking an indirect approach at what you're really interested in, right? You'd love to know, in many cases, if one thing is causing another, but there's generally a vague scientific consensus on what it takes to suggest that one thing caused another. And there's all these written out criteria that I don't have them like tattooed on my arm. So I don't know if I'll have them off the top of my head. But the general premise is, you know, a randomized controlled trial is just better suited to make that type of claim because you can establish we've got this group of people who are reasonably similar to one another. The only thing that we've changed via random assignment is the exposure to this intervention or not exposure to this intervention. Hopefully, we've convinced the people not exposed to this intervention that they're getting some type of equivalent intervention so that we are accounting for placebo effects or expectancy effects. And very importantly, because we are assigning these people to a very specific intervention, we have reason to believe that we have a good understanding of exactly how their day-to-day life is changing in this intervention, and that it's not being caused by just tendencies. So a lot of times it's like people will look at a single nutrient correlation with a particular health outcome and say, well, this caused that. Well, not really. We might just be looking at a profile of maybe the type of person who tends to eat this kind of thing, which includes that nutrient, is also the kind of person who tends to have this type of health outcome, right? So just a very basic example that people bring up all the time is healthy user bias, right? We've been told for years and years and years and years, spinach and kale are great. And so even if we lived in I'm not making this claim, but if we lived in a world where those two food ingredients had absolutely no impact on health, positive or negative, if we could convince the public that if you care about your health, you should be eating this in high amounts, then probably the folks opting to eat more of that, I mean, it's generally not for the flavor, to be honest. It's probably that they're doing many different behaviors within their power to improve their long-term health outcomes. So all of that is to say, like with a randomized controlled trial, we're not just kind of saying, hey, who wants to be in this group, who wants to be in that group, and kind of sorting them based on preference. We're using randomization to kind of nip that in the bud. And a fantastic thing with controlling the intervention in an experimental setup is that you can also establish a temporal relationship or a time-linked relationship where we can say at baseline, these groups were not different from one another. If you happen to test it, there's reasons why you probably don't need to, but basically we separated this into two groups who at baseline we have every reason to believe were fairly similar, but after we introduce this change, we see these results that we very much anticipated based on a plausible explanatory mechanism. So a randomized controlled trial has all these different things working for it in terms of rigorously setting up this idea of causation. And there are so many things with correlation, so many spurious relationships that can sometimes lead us astray. And I do think that this is a timely conversation because now that there are kind of lower barriers to massive analysis of giant data sets from people who have strong technology backgrounds but don't have a lot of exposure to statistical theory and best practices. I can tell you right now that in a lot of companies, there are probably a lot of folks who are doing very misguided kind of exploratory analysis using various types of machine learning approaches. And they are probably getting spurious correlations left and right. And if they're not careful, they may be building some of these nonsense relationships into key elements of their business practice, which ultimately, it's hard to say what impact that'll have because it's a random effect, right? So it'll probably have a random, hard to guess impact on the success or failure of their business practices. But you certainly don't want to be just kind of blindly following these correlations without having a decent idea of how and why this correlation might be occurring. And I think with machine learning and these just vast amounts of data that are now accessible to a lot of companies and other entities, we're probably going to be going through a period. We're probably already in it, but we're probably in a period of some of the worst decisions made on the highest volume of spurious correlations probably in human history, because it used to be a pain in the butt to do any kind of statistical analysis.
Right. And so going back to the idea of the randomized controlled trials and how they actually are controlled, like one way I might think of this is we have a basketball team with 5 players on the court. You might want to sub in Johnny to see if starting with Johnny will help the team play better or help them win. But if you're gonna, this kind of is, I think, a decent analogy when with what you were talking about with dietary interventions is if you're going to sub Johnny in, you're not just adding Johnny, you're now also taking out somebody else. And so with a randomized controlled trial, you could account for that in that you might rerun the game 5 times, each time subbing Johnny out for a different person. Because if you only did it once, maybe the team wins, but it's not actually because Johnny is adding anything. It's just you sub Johnny in for Mikey, and Mikey takes a bunch of bad shots that always loses you the game. Talk to me about how in observational studies, the researchers will use statistics to try to mimic that adjustment in that control. Like when you look at the design, they'll say that they did adjustment for all these other variables. To me, it's kind of like they survey the subjects, they follow them over all the years, they have the results, and now it seems like they're using statistics to try to see if this was a randomized controlled trial, if all these things were controlled for, how would these results look? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think it's common practice and should be out of necessity, but in a lot of observational studies, like you said, they will use different kinds of terminology. Sometimes they'll say we controlled for these variables. Sometimes they will say we adjusted our models to account for these variables. I am much fonder of the latter than the former. I don't like using the phrase that I controlled for this variable and that variable, because I do think it's an important distinction between statistical adjustment after the fact and literally controlling a variable through experimental design. And I never want to conflate those two. They are those statistical adjustments to adjust for, potential covariates, confounding variables, things like that. They are attempting to do what you would love to have done with actual controls in terms of, generating the data, the actual observations that created this data. But you can't in these observational retrospective scenarios. So you might say, okay, we're going to study the relationship between saturated fat intake and metabolic syndrome prevalence, right? And you might say, well, with metabolic syndrome, we think we should probably adjust to account for low physical activity levels. Maybe you want to adjust for age. Maybe you want to adjust for smoking. Maybe you want to adjust for sugar intake. Any number of variables that you say, well, we believe that these probably are also impacting outcomes, and we're hoping to kind of isolate just the effect of this saturated fat, this main predictor variable that we're interested in. So it's often the best you can do. And we can get as detailed as you like about this, but one thing I caution about this general process and procedure when it comes to interpretation is that there's no way to statistically fabricate genuine control. What we're doing is saying, basically, I'm going to include these predictors in the model. And what I'm going to do is, like, let's say we're doing the saturated fat and metabolic syndrome analysis. We're going to control for smoking. Well, what I'm doing is basically saying all of the variance in the likelihood of developing metabolic syndrome that can be associated with smoking status is going to be kind of partialed out of this analysis. So what that means is the extent to which smoking status independently predicts the outcome, metabolic syndrome risk or prevalence, the likelihood of developing it, we're going to account for that in the model so that people with, a smoker and non-smoker, we're going to try to kind of equate them in terms of their risk for developing this outcome, but very roughly speaking. And what can be really challenging about that is you're not only accounting for the independent effect of smoking on metabolic syndrome, you are also, in the overwhelming, vast majority of models, you're also kind of taking out the portion of metabolic syndrome risk that is described by the shared predictive utility of saturated fat intake and smoking, right? So you can think of this risk as being kind of a Venn diagram when we look at these two variables. There's the variance in metabolic syndrome risk that is only attributable to saturated fat, and there's the other portion that's only attributable to saturated fat and smoking, and then that middle part of the Venn diagram that is shared. In this case, you're kind of eliminating the effect independently of smoking and the shared portion that between smoking and saturated fat intake. That becomes a big deal when you are including a bunch of covariates that correlate with the predictor that you're interested in, right? Because for example, if you say, hey, we only want to look at the effects of physical activity, and it's like volitional leisure time physical activity, and everyone's been told for the last 50 years, if you want to be healthy, exercise more, and you control for all these other variables that are correlated with basically making volitional, thoughtful, proactive health changes or engaging in health behaviors, you're starting to actually chip away at that effect of physical activity because you're controlling for all these things that overlap with it so much. And when you have a predictor in this model that is dramatically overlapped with all these different covariates, in a weird way, it can start to get very abstract when you start to say, what does this actual variable represent? Like, what is the effect of this health behavior if we eliminate all elements that could possibly be, mutually associated with all these other things? So the more that you chip away at that predictor by including a ton of covariates, especially if they're highly related to that predictor, the more your interpretation gets very messy and hard to actually define, because you're like, well, what is this variable after we kind of eliminate all of the shared variance with all these things that clearly share a lot of variance with it? It becomes very difficult to define what your independent variable actually is. Probably more detail than we needed, but I do think it's important to make that point because a lot of people are going to look at a paper and they're not even going to get to saying, hey, what covariates were in the model, right? I acknowledge that. But a percentage of the people who do are going to say, oh, they controlled for smoking, age, and biological sex. Great. they controlled for that, don't have to worry about that. It couldn't have possibly influenced the outcome of this analysis. And the answer is it could. It could very dramatically impact the outcome of this analysis. And that's why it's often good. And you will see this a lot. In observational studies, a lot of people will say, here is what we call my crude model, or like a raw model that is just my predictor and my outcome, and maybe one or two other things, maybe. And they'll show you different elements of like, and then when we add in all these covariates, you can rest assured that we are not dramatically impacting the interpretation of this variable. So there's, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. When it comes to these, we talked about this kind of spectrum of different types of research. A lot of times basic science, mechanistic science, the stats are very simple, very straightforward. They're like, hey, the complexity of our study comes from the theory, the experimental design, the control that we're implementing. Once we get the data, the hard part's over. We did all the fancy complex stuff that generates quality, robust data. Now we're just going to do a t-test or a correlation. Like there's a ton of basic research that's basically just that. And the t-test, people have been doing those by hand since like the early 1900s in the Guinness Brewery, right? I mean, this is not sophisticated calculation. I don't want to detract from the brilliance of developing that for the purpose of beer testing. It's a fun little historical anecdote, but nowadays it's a very simple analysis to do. When you get into observational stuff and meta-analysis, that's where the statistical analysis can often get really complex. And people will start to add a lot of different bells and whistles because they say, hey, we couldn't control the design. We couldn't control all these variables via experimental manipulation. The best we can do is try to use these sophisticated statistical approaches to try to make sure we're getting the clearest view possible of this relationship.
To what you said about it might have not even been worth to go that deep into it because only so many people are going to get to the point of actually reading, oh, here's the crude model, here's adjusted model one, multi-adjusted model. I think even for people who aren't reading that, it's useful to understand what you just described because you'll hear, on other podcasts or on social media, someone will say, oh, well, it was an observational study, but we adjusted for all these other things, BMI, calorie intake, all these other things. And even then, it's just valuable to understand what they're saying. And I think for me, it's really tempting when you read one of those papers, and especially in the discussion section, they'll say strength, we adjusted for all these things. And granted, most of the time, or pretty much all the time, in the limitations, they'll say, but you still, this is still an observational study. It doesn't show causation. It's tempting, if you're not super familiar with the statistics or really have a grasp for what you were just describing, to say, oh, well, they controlled for all of these things, so their result might as well have been a randomized controlled trial. And so, I think that was still really valuable to bring up. And I'm sure you can relate in that it's interesting when we look at, whatever dispute over social media, you'll see one camp points to observational research not being well controlled and not being as useful when it shows certain results, but then they really value it when it shows other results. And then, on the other side, there are probably examples of the same thing. Moving further, kind of with the adjustments, can you talk about the subgroup analyses and kind of your approach to looking at those? As I understand it, technically, and correct me if I'm wrong, the more subgroup analyses you do, kind of the stricter you are with your interpretation of them, maybe, in terms of p-values and stuff. And we'll get to p-values in a minute. But again, correct me if I'm wrong. And just how do you think about subgroup analyses, or is there anything worth noting for people listening?
Subgroup analyses, you can have some interesting debates about how to approach them, because if you are someone who's going into a study and hoping to find something that is statistically significant, that shouldn't be the objective of scientific inquiry, but there are some practical pressures that lead people in that direction. Certainly, if that was your goal, you maximize your likelihood by doing more and more subgroup analyses. And as you kind of chop up a data set into many smaller data sets for these analyses, there's just the sheer number of tests that is increasing that probability of finding something that's statistically significant. But also, you are now creating smaller groups of individuals for these analyses. And generally speaking, as groups get smaller, robustness of the effect estimate that we generate tends to go down. That is very much why there's that pyramid, or upside down funnel shape in a funnel plot. Is as studies get smaller, we do expect more variance in the effect size calculated from one study to the next. There's just more sampling error is the term that's often used. So in order to address some of those concerns, often people will say that they're going to do some type of adjustment for multiplicity, or basically saying, hey, I'm going to basically change the threshold needed for a statistically significant finding, because I'm doing all these additional tests. I need to make the bar a little bit harder to clear that and say this is statistically significant. And that's generally done in hopes of establishing more robustness for the finding and saying, hey, we weren't just like throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick here. We have some fairly stringent standards and wanted to keep to that. Now, you can make good arguments that are very much in favor of doing a bunch of subgroup analyses. You could say, hey, this is a meaningful element of the research question, we have good theoretical reason based on past literature or a strong biological mechanism to indicate that this group should respond different from that one, and we want to test that. That makes all the sense in the world. And sometimes there's practical reasons why practical and theoretical, why you would maybe decide not to make those p-value adjustments to raise that bar for clearing statistical significance. I think that's where you get some really heated debates about kind of the theoretical underpinning for why we even have this threshold and where it should be. And so, yeah, that's we can get more into that discussion if you like. But generally speaking, there's kind of two camps, right? There's some people who say, if you're going to be doing all these different comparisons and subgroups, you need to raise that bar for clearing statistical significance, because it's very bad if you find some spurious relationship that's not genuinely true at the population level, and you start reporting this all over town, and you're causing all this fanfare and excitement over something that's not a legitimate finding. On the other hand, it's important to recognize that missing significant outcomes is not a good thing either, right? So there is a give and take. There's a trade-off where if you decided, different fields are different. Sometimes people test for a p-value at 0.05 or an alpha level at 0.05. In other fields, there are certain tests where you might do 0.1 in some cases, and there's certainly in physics and engineering, you're going a lot of zeros before you get to any digits. So those are always interesting debates to be involved with, and it's very simple. It's what is the cost of identifying or flagging an important effect that is not actually true, and also what is the value of, in the interest of being rigorous and stringent, missing valuable insights from your data. And a great example that gets used all the time is, we're familiar with this trade-off in the legal system, right? There is a cost of not prosecuting someone who committed a crime. We fail to bring justice for the victim of that crime. There is also a tremendous cost of, prosecuting someone and finding them guilty if they did not do the crime, right? So we know when we walk into a jury trial, for example, we don't want to just err on the side of, well, just throw them in jail no matter what, just to be safe, right? Because that's not just to be safe. There's trade-offs on both sides of that. And at the same time, you're not going to walk in and say, hey, there's nothing that can happen in this room that's going to have me throw this person in jail. I'm sure they didn't do it. And who does that really help anyway? Well, it brings justice to the victim, and in some cases may protect society from someone who needs serious rehabilitation, right? And could be dangerous. So all of that is to say, yeah, there's trade-offs on both sides of that, and that's why you get really heated discussions sometimes about how to approach that question.
Yeah, I remember, I forget who it was, but I was listening to a podcast at some point, and someone was saying that there's a lot more pressure to not produce a false positive. In other words, saying that a finding is legitimate or that there's something there when actually there isn't, because then this could send you down a rabbit hole of a bunch of follow-on studies being conducted with the assumption that that first one actually found something. I think maybe a good example of this, I don't know too much about it, but the what is it with neurodegenerative disease? There was some study that was...
oh, man, yeah. Alzheimer's research is a mess.
Yeah, we could probably talk about that for a while. It seems like you have a lot to say there, but pretty much there was some finding about the mechanism of Alzheimer's disease that was falsified, and then based on that, there were a bunch of other studies for years that were conducted, and those studies cost money and cost time, resources, and then also there's the cost of losing resources that could have been given elsewhere, or time that could have been spent researching something else for, in this case, potentially having a legitimate finding that could help people with Alzheimer's. But the way you phrase it, I just now am realizing there's also, I guess, a trade-off in the other direction, in that if you're not stringent enough, you could also be missing a legitimate finding that without that finding, there would also be several other studies conducted otherwise and a bunch of other costs looking for that same finding in follow-on studies.
Yeah. I mean, it's really simple if you think about like the basic thing, curing cancer. Everybody wants it, right? So you test a treatment for cancer, for example. If you say, hey, good news, everybody, this thing cures cancer, and then they do multiple studies and find out, no, it doesn't. That's not a good outcome, right? But at the same time, if you do a study and say, tried another thing, guess what? This one doesn't cure cancer either. Everyone stop looking into it. No one study it again. We're shutting it all down. Well, what if it does? Like what if you stack the deck in your study design or have a spurious finding where an actually effective treatment did not work based on your approach to your statistics? It's also not good to just permanently shut doors and miss these effects if they are in fact real. So yeah, there's a give and take.
I want to take a second to go back for anyone listening who doesn't know what subgroup analyses are, which I realize I forgot to kind of explain that, but it's pretty much just looking at an outcome. Say if you had 30 subjects, maybe you split it up into 15 females and 15 males. You go back and look, oh, well, you have this overarching outcome for all the subjects together, but is there a difference in outcome between females and males? And then, you could do that with a bunch of different subgroup analyses, like you were talking about, I think, way earlier in the conversation. But sorry to anyone listening who was just looking at this for the past 15 minutes.
Yeah, but the one thing I will add, though, on subgroup analyses is you should have a good reason to do it. Every now and then you will find some unscrupulous researchers who are like, hey, we made this contrived subgroup, which just so happens to turn a non-significant effect into a significant effect, right? Every now and then you'll find people who are kind of fishing around and they've got their thumb on the scale and they make some ridiculous grouping system. And you're like, I see what happened here. Another thing you have to be cautious of is like, people don't get away with it as often now as they used to, but I can definitely find some papers where someone said, what we did was we broke it into responders and non-responders using some completely indefensible criteria. And what do you know? It worked in the responders, which is basically like you got an average effect of 0. And you said, well, what if we just didn't include anyone who had a value below 0? And so you just got like a perfectly unremarkable 0 effect study but you decided to say, well, actually half of these people got worse and half got better. And it's like, yeah, that's how averages work. I think that's 100% what you would expect in a study that has no effect at all. So with subgroup analyses, you do have to kind of look at them with a skeptical eye, at least in terms of, in my opinion, how those subgroups were formed and whether or not there's a reasonable justification for that.
Gotcha. And also for anyone who's hearing about like p-values and significance, we're going to get there. Before we talk about that, I just want to touch on mechanistic studies a little bit, because I think this type of study design is becoming more important from like a social media aspect, where I'm sure you've seen there are a lot of people who will throw out this one mechanistic study and say, okay, X leads to Y leads to Z, and now Y equals, and draw these kind of overarching assumptions or pretty much over extrapolate based off of mechanistic studies. And so I'm kind of curious what your thought is there. And then also, I guess a more specific question is, can you explain or delve into the differences in magnitude of findings for mechanistic studies versus those in human studies? An example you'll probably be very familiar with is, as I understand it, if you look at a muscle hypertrophy study, in a muscle cell, you'll see muscle protein synthesis increase by maybe hundreds of percents. But then you won't see that translate into the muscle growing, like the whole muscle growing by hundreds of percents. I know that was kind of a loaded question there, so I can repeat any of that. But
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, yeah, the general idea is you got to be really careful with extrapolation, because we talked about how a lot of research, whether you know it or not, hopefully you do, you're walking into it with a lot of assumptions that you already signed up for just by virtue of how the study was approached. And when you're making these extrapolations from a mechanism to an outcome that's several steps down the chain, you're basically making the assumption, if I assume that I know everything about everything that could possibly affect this process and all the intermediate steps, and this mechanism is the essentially singular cause of the downstream response and cannot be affected by anything that is known or unknown, then I should feel good about this extrapolation. That's almost never true, especially in the human body, which is very complex. And that is why, as you alluded to, we will sometimes have these like really meticulously designed mechanistic or basic studies that are, purely set up to induce these enormous responses in a particular mechanism. Especially when you start getting into study designs where we are taking tissues out of the body and treating them with certain, putting them in a bath of this and treating them with that chemical. We see these massive changes. And yeah, when you start then looking at downstream effects, you start throwing in the fact that most things in our body are impacted by several different interacting systems. We see that these huge mechanisms, by the time we get to downstream effects, maybe they don't matter to a detectable degree. Maybe they don't matter to a clinically meaningful degree anymore. But certainly they are, in every case I can think of, they are very muted relative to the kind of massive changes we see in these mechanistic studies.
And one thing I've been thinking about lately about over extrapolating mechanistic studies is the people who are most or maybe most vulnerable to kind of falling prey to that, or to making that over extrapolation themselves, are people like me when I was in middle school and high school, people who know like just enough to be dangerous. And that, like I said, like people I knew closely probably would have said that I knew what I was talking about with health and fitness stuff. And looking back now, I really knew almost nothing. And it's just funny. Like if you went back a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, whatever, I was pretty much boxed full hook, line, and sinker into the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And for anyone listening, it's this is pretty much the idea that insulin is a hormone associated or that acts to help energy be stored within cells. And so the idea is that spiking your insulin is going to lead to weight gain, and in ways that do not necessarily agree with a calories in, calories out model, which pretty much describes your change in weight is dictated by how much you're burning versus how much you're consuming in a really oversimplified manner. But I feel like looking back now, falling into the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, I feel like that's almost a natural pathway for someone who takes their first introduction to biology course and learns like, oh, insulin does this in your body. And yeah, I don't know if you can relate to that at all. Like looking back, it's so easy if you're not uh, tuned into the broader body of evidence, or like I was talking about at the very beginning of this, the kind of everything that goes into reaching conclusions that you see in the textbook, to buy into those mechanisms. And it makes sense. Like for someone also who isn't even like a biology major or anything like that, it just makes sense when you see someone pop up on social media that's says something that really should be logical, right? If insulin is associated with energy storage, then you don't want to spike your insulin. Like on the surface level, that kind of makes sense if you just think about it. But yeah, it's just kind of funny to me who's most vulnerable or who's most likely to make those over extrapolations.
Yeah, and those mechanistic oversimplifications can take a lot of different forms in varying degrees, right? So you could run into, there are people who have made very compelling arguments for the carbohydrate insulin model. I don't believe they're correct, but they are still, pretty convincing if you are not really tapped into the contradictory literature. But you'll also see a lot of stuff where folks make really basic assumptions where they'll just say like, hey, your muscles are X% water and it's a high number. Therefore, obviously you need to drink a lot of water to build muscle, right? And you're like, that's such a vague kind of platitude. But you know that some people are going to hear that and say, yeah, that's intuitive. That makes sense. I probably will drink more water to build more muscle. And it's like, we'll see. That probably works to the extent that you're avoiding substantial dehydration. And beyond that, it's probably not doing anything. But yeah, it can be really tricky with mechanisms. Sometimes they come in the form of these kind of superficial platitudes that sound convincing enough that you're like, whatever, I'll go with it. Sometimes they do come in the form of, people have written entire books and, several research papers kind of explaining in the most nuanced ways possible why they believe that model to be correct. And while I don't believe the model to be correct, I can certainly see how a lot of people would find those arguments to be convincing.
And so moving on, we've talked a lot about kind of conceptual ideas, research, study design, and hierarchy scientific method. Now, maybe we'll get into like a few kind of buzzwords when it comes to the actual statistics. And I want to get into p-values and statistical significance. And maybe if you think it makes sense to start here, I know I'm listening to you. I know you're not only big on science statistics, but also kind of on the history of science, and then also maybe the history of statistics. You're talking about beer sampling or t-tests earlier. I don't know if it makes sense to kind of identify why it's even important. Why is statistics even connected to this process? Like, why can't we just look at what happens and make conclusions off of that, if that makes sense at all?
Yeah, it's, I believe his name was William Gossett. He was working at the Guinness Brewery, and was one of the things he was tasked with was quality control and testing samples. And one of the reasons that the mathematics and the theory for the t-test was invented was it enables you to systematically sample from your population of that, particular brew of beer, so that instead of wasting huge amounts of beer for testing, you can confidently take a small sample and extrapolate that finding out toward the entire brew for that, day or whatever, that, batch or lot or whatever, if we want to generalize out to just kind of, food product testing in general. So in that case, it matters because there's this trade-off. If we test every single bottle, that's not an economical or time efficient way to do this. But if we're going to cut some corners and not test that extensively, we need to have confidence that we're doing it adequately, right? Going to more trivial and more pedantic matters, there's the old story of the lady tasting tea. As the story goes, I believe it was Fisher, if not Fisher Pearson, one of those two, but a statistician who developed a lot of early calculations and theories and stats. But they were allegedly having tea with someone, a woman who said, I can taste the difference between if you put milk in the cup and then tea versus if you put tea in the cup and then milk. Like, I can taste the difference in those two sequences, even if the same amounts are put in. Now, if a friend told me that, being a well-adjusted adult, I would say, wow, that's very interesting, and I'd probably leave it. But maybe I'm not built the way that a early 1900s statistician is built, far more pedantic than myself. And they said, I need to design an experiment to prove you right or prove you wrong in my mind. And so they kind of laid out the general foundation for the calculation of p ratios, or basically the layman's terms explanation of a p-value in this case is, what's my bar that I'm setting for you to actually prove to me that you can really taste this, right? Like, because if you just guess one time, that doesn't impress me at all. That's not an unusual task. But if I give you 5 cups and you get 4 out of 5 right, does that reach my threshold for saying, wow, you actually are able to do this? 4 out of 5, probably not, right? So the question is, how many cups do you have to give? And how many successful replications, what proportion of success to failure in this identification sequence would someone have to achieve for you to say, I'm actually convinced that you were not guessing there, you were not getting this right by chance, but you actually are able to discern which one was added first. So yeah, in terms of like the history of statistics, it helps us in the case of William Gossett answer really important questions about, how can we use a small picture of a vast quantity of data and still make rigorous inferences and gain insights from that we can really hang our hat on. But then in the other case, it's, how do we actually feel confident in knowing what we believe to know? So really these things pertain to our ability to move forward in the world with some degree of confidence that is drawn systematically and mathematically rather than just being a gut feeling. So ultimately, I'd say that's why it's important, is like I said, in research, there's a good reason why every claim that you make in your little conclusion section, if it's contradictory to your statistical findings, you're going to have a hard time getting that published, and you're really going to have to work hard to defend it. And your defense is, in a lot of cases, going to be inadequate. The stats basically help us formalize an agreed upon system for determining high confidence observations versus low confidence observations.
And so in like the most simplified version possible, is it fair to say that a p-value kind of answers the question, is this legit?
I think it answers the question, is this legit? That's an interesting way to phrase it. I would say it answers the question, what is the probability of this being a noteworthy observation from a probability perspective, right? So if we were to go with like the strict definition, my best off the cuff strict definition would be, if we assume the null hypothesis is true, and that is our understanding of the world, that we are saying and committing to the idea that the null hypothesis is true. We just collected this data. We just did this statistical test. What is the probability that we would obtain data this incompatible with the null hypothesis or more incompatible with the null hypothesis? So basically, if we're comparing, intervention versus placebo, the null hypothesis is the intervention and the placebo are going to have the same effect, period. And we're basically going into the analysis and saying, we believe that to be true. So we're starting with our conclusion basically and working back logically to the probability of getting data that we did get, right? So it's very counterintuitive. It's why people really wrestle with this concept and If you just like grab a scientist and say, quick, define a p-value, they will probably get it somewhere between a little wrong and very wrong in terms of how to actually describe it accurately. But and I'm sure some statistician is going to poke a hole in the way that I'm describing it now, like I guarantee it. But the idea is we are accepting, or we are going into it with the assumption that the null hypothesis is true, and then saying, okay, under that assumption, what's the probability of essentially getting data this weird, this incompatible with the null hypothesis? So going back to that example, well, if we assume that this intervention is exactly the same as placebo, what's the probability that we would actually get data showing this positive of an effect of the intervention compared to the placebo? And if that probability is very low, then intuitively you have to say, I'm thinking maybe we shouldn't have assumed that the null hypothesis is true. I'm actually thinking that maybe our data are giving us the hint that the null hypothesis is not true. And so at that point, you would say, okay, this is perhaps an eye-opening, kind of noteworthy finding, because it is basically telling us if you're going to sign up to that assumption that the null hypothesis is true and this thing is not going to have any meaningful effect. I shouldn't say the word meaningful there. Strike that from the record. This isn't going to have any effect relative to a placebo. Well, if you're telling me that, okay, that's fine to make that assumption, but the likelihood that you were going to get these findings is 1 in 10,000, I'm starting to question that null hypothesis, and I'm starting to think maybe this thing works.
So going back to your tea example, like you said, we can't just give this lady 1 cup of tea and see if she gets it right, because especially in this oversimplified example, she has a 50% chance of guessing whether the milk went first or the tea went first.
Yeah, who cares?
And if we do it 100 times, statistically still, there are going to be a handful of times where she actually guesses correct. And if what I'm hearing you, or if I'm understanding what you're saying, is pretty much the p-value is saying, okay, we just tested her a ton of times. It's really unlikely that she wouldn't know how to do this and have guessed it correctly so many times. Is that
right? Yeah. The null hypothesis there is you're full of it. There's no way that you can taste that, because that's a ridiculous thing to say. But then, if I lay out, 100 cups of tea and you get it right 99 times out of 100, how could I make any conclusion other than, yeah, you actually can taste that? Like, I don't know how you're doing this, but something is up, right? And so sometimes when I would teach this to classes, I used to teach a class where we would talk a little bit about statistics, but it was first-year college students, and I'd try to make it really accessible. Basically, what I would do is I would play a card trick on them, but pretend I wasn't. And so we would kind of work through the probabilities of, like, if I wasn't maliciously misleading you, if I wasn't playing a trick, what are the odds that this would be occurring? And we would kind of go through the sequence of, like, I think it generally took the setup of me guessing a card that someone had, right? And so it's like, well, if I guess the right color, there's only 2 colors, right? 50-50. But if I guess the right, what do they call it? The suit? Is that what they call it with cards? Like diamonds, hearts, clubs, spades, all that stuff. Okay, 1 out of 4 is okay, right? But it's still not that impressive, right? So we kind of increasingly went down this row of where I start saying, okay, you picked your card and I know what it is, but they didn't know that. And I say, like, okay, I think it's red. And it's red, obviously. And so is anybody weirded out by this? No. And then I say, okay, but I think it's a diamond. Is anybody weirded out by that? And they say, no. I say, I think it's a red diamond face card. So Jack, King, Queen is maybe an ace. I don't know if that counts or not. But so we kind of increasingly went down and eventually I said, okay, it's the, Jack of diamonds or whatever. And by that point, everyone is saying something's up here. There's no way that in this one class example, you just happen to get this right on your first try, right? So that's really what the p-value is trying to quantify, is that general sense of uneasiness as we go from guessing red or black to guessing, the Jack of diamonds or whatever. There's going to be some threshold there where we say, okay, There's no way. I've had enough. Something is up here. And that's where we reject the null hypothesis. And we say, I'm starting to think that the null hypothesis actually isn't true here. Another thing you could do is, I'll do this with a class as well. I say, I don't do this as an example for obvious reasons, but you flip a coin once and you get heads. That's not surprising at all, right? You get heads twice in a row. Okay, fine, no big deal. But again, the more I go heads, 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 at a certain point, they reach this level of discomfort. And what I like to do with these examples is actually calculate what was the probability level when everyone said, I'm out. Like, this is too weird for me. And it often does tend to be, depending on the circumstance, it often does tend to be pretty close to a lot of the heuristics that we use for p-value cutoffs.
Very interesting. I want to build off of kind of the concept or the framework we just talked about for p-values and talking about what impacts kind of the statistics going into the p-value. But first, can you maybe outline like the actual numbers associated with the p-value? So, for example, you mentioned earlier you called it an alpha level, which is, for anyone listening, just another way of saying p-value of 0.05. Can you explain what that number means, why that's the number that people commonly use for determining statistical significance?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the alpha level is synonymous with the p-value. Sometimes it is treated that way in papers, but basically, like, what we're thinking about here is limbo, right? Like the game where you try to crawl under the bar. The alpha level is where we set the bar. The p-value is the actual number that you get from your calculations. And if the p-value is higher than where the bar is set, you bump into it, you lose, right? If the p-value is extremely low, you just walk right under that bar, right? So, so a lot of times the convention is to say alpha is 0.05 in the type of fields that I work in. And so that is to say, hey, if our probability of getting data this weird or weirder, assuming the null hypothesis, is less than 5%, then we feel pretty good saying, hey, we're really doubting the null hypothesis here. We think we've really found something, right? So that's kind of how it works, is you set this probability level with your alpha level, and then the p-value is your calculated probability of getting data that weird or weirder under the assumption of the null hypothesis. And whether or not you're below that alpha level with your p-value is how you decide to reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject it. And I think it's important to highlight that 5% alpha level. That's common in the social sciences, the health sciences, exercise science, things like that. But you can understand why, if I am doing some testing on the properties of a hinge or, some element of like a spaceship, like a rocket, I probably want to have more confidence than that, right? Like a 95% level of confidence is probably not going to do, because imagine that I have, I'm testing the strength of this junction on a rocket that's going to space, and we've got 35 of these junctions on the spacecraft or the rocket ship, and if one of them goes, then the whole thing implodes, right? Obviously, in that case, we're not going 5% for our alpha level, right? We're going 0.00000, fill in as many zeros as you like, but we're going to have to go into that with a much higher level of confidence because the stakes are just too high. And when it comes to physics and engineering, the opportunity to have extremely high levels of precision is actually possible, right? Like, I'll go ahead and skip ahead. You asked, like, well, what really goes into a p-value? And there's multiple things. It's, the number of observations, or as we often say, the number of people in a study, for example. Another factor is how large is the effect of the thing you're looking at, which is pretty intuitive. But the final thing is, how much variance or variability do you have in these measurements, right? So if you're measuring something that's really messy, when you start getting into like questionnaires for human beings who vary from day to day and have different interpretations of the questions, it's hard to get ultra precise data from that type of subjective kind of questionnaire. Whereas if you're doing engineering calculations, you should be pretty doggone sure of what you're doing, and your level of precision is going to be through the roof, or should be. So yeah, that's ultimately what goes into a p-value. To get a really low p-value, something where you say, I am really skeptical of this null hypothesis, the ultimate procedure for that, or the ultimate scenario, is huge study, bunch of people, a lot of measurements, a lot of observations, massive difference between this intervention and the placebo group, as an example, and very consistent measurements. So something that's measured with low error, you're getting really good measurements of the thing that your outcome, and this is a really consistent effect. So everyone in the intervention group is having pretty similar results, and everyone in the placebo group is having pretty similar results to each other, right? So we have this massive clean gap that's measured with precision, and there's very little variability in the data. That's kind of the perfect recipe for a very low p-value.
And can you talk about how, like, I don't know if all of the factors you just mentioned, but at least some of them go into calculating the power of a study? And can you explain what that kind of means?
Yeah, so the power of a study is the probability of obtaining a significant finding or rejecting the null hypothesis, assuming that the null hypothesis. Let me walk myself through this definition here. It's the probability that, like, if this effect is actually true in the population, that you're going to successfully detect it, right? And so, generally speaking, you want to have, in a lot of studies, they'll say we want to have 80% power or 90% power. But like I said, it's basically, in layman's terms, if this effect is real, there's a real thing going on here. What's our probability of actually successfully detecting that within this study that we are arranging with our statistical test? And so obviously, based on that, the p-value, or the p-value and alpha level and power level, they're all kind of related, right? So if you, for example, have an underpowered study, it's going to be less likely that you obtain a low p-value when you run this study. And so you have a higher risk that even though this is technically a real thing out in the world, you have failed to detect a significant finding with the study that you've designed. So yeah, the two are kind of inversely related, in the sense that if you have a really, really well-powered study, the likelihood of obtaining a low p-value, if there's a real effect going on, it certainly goes up.
And so bringing this back to some of the analogies we were using, you were talking about sample size, going back to that lady with the T. We know testing her once isn't enough. Maybe if we tested her 10 times, we would really need her to get it right every single time for us to be pretty convinced. Whereas if we tested her 100 times, maybe now the bar is dropped to she only needs to get it right 99 out of the 100 times. And then if we test her 1,000 times, now it's dropping even less and less. The more the greater the sample, the more attempts we have, the lower the bar goes. And so if we looked at an intervention with different subjects, the more subjects we have, the lower the bar goes, or the higher the bar. I'm losing track of my analogy here. In terms of determining whether or not we think that there's a real effect here, versus if we only have 10 subjects, it really needs to play out for all of these subjects. Is that vaguely?
Vaguely, yeah. And I should clarify, in talking about statistical power, rather than looking at the kind of relationship between power and p-value, I think it's probably more intuitive to look at the relationship between power and alpha. Okay, so that kind of that threshold. So, for example, if we decide that we are going to make it really hard to find a statistically significant finding, right? So if instead of using alpha of 0.05, we say, nope, it's got to be under 0.01, right? So we're really making it very stringent in order to reject that null hypothesis. In that case, as we lower that alpha level, our statistical power goes down, right? Because it's going to be harder to actually get there, right? So, basically, there's this interplay between how stringent we're going to be with what our criteria is for significance, our sample size, how accurately we can measure our outcome. All these things work together to ultimately impact the observed results of a study.
Gotcha. And then continuing with kind of some of the other factors you mentioned, if we look at the T example, it's not really that impressive, like you said, for her to guess the correct answer because she already has a really good shot at guessing it's 50-50. Whereas for the card example, if you were going to guess the exact card, the exact color, suit, and number, that would be really impressive, even if you did that once. So, like, if you do that 5 times, I'm probably really bought in. Whereas if a lady guessed the T 5 times, I'm like, okay, let's keep the T coming because I'm still not quite convinced. Does that play into maybe the magnitude of the outcome or the variance? Are you seeing like the connection I'm drawing here?
Yeah, it's an important point. So, like I said, when you start getting into these really large studies, you do tend to see p-values getting lower, right? So, large number of participants, large number of observations, however you want to frame it, right? And so what that means is, I've worked with data where you've got literally tens of thousands of study participants. And so you might find a statistically significant reduction in systolic blood pressure, right? P-values super tiny. But when you analyze that data, you see that the reduction in systolic blood pressure is like 1 millimeter mercury, right? So their blood pressure was 126/70, and it went down to 125/70. You probably don't want to put out a press release and say, hey, good news, we cured hypertension, right? Because first of all, they didn't have hypertension in the first place. And second of all, that's not a clinically meaningful effect. But when you have these massive sample sizes, you do sometimes find that you get these really tiny effects that just by the sheer volume of observations become, they reach that criteria for statistical significance. So when you're interpreting a study, you want to consider not just was this a statistically significant effect, but also you want to say, if it is statistically significant, and I feel like this is actually, a somewhat robust approximation of the effect that I can hang my hat on, then the next question is, do I actually care about the magnitude of this effect? And if it's really, really, really tiny, maybe not.
Gotcha. How are you doing on time right now?
I probably do have to go pretty shortly here. Yeah.
Okay. I just have maybe 1 or 2 more things then that I'll prioritize.
Cool. Yeah.
So there are 2 concepts I'm going to kind of mold together here. The first, I first came across listening to Dr. Brad Schoenfeld talk about applying research to the real world. And one of the things he talked about was, because as you're aware, there's kind of this divide maybe in the health and fitness, especially in like the resistance training community, maybe of like science-based practitioners versus, I don't know what you would call the other group, but people who just train or make recommendations based off of experience, maybe. And somebody asked him, I think, a question related to that, and he said that the 2 aren't mutually exclusive, and that real science-based practice is taking what we see in the research, combining it with personal experience, and then applying it to specific contexts. And so combining that idea with what I kind of think of as like an N=1 approach, which is taking population data and then applying it to yourself. For example, an example that I usually use is like there's this idea that individuals who are vegan or vegetarian are going to have an issue with getting enough protein in to make sure that they have enough muscle mass and they have enough strength. And maybe if you look across populations, people who are vegan and vegetarian tend to consume less protein and maybe they could use a little bit more. And that might be a concern if you adopt one of these diets. So you can look at that from a population perspective, but then say you're looking at yourself as an individual who consumes a vegan or vegetarian diet and you're jacked and super strong. Applying that to yourself, you don't really have to worry about that population data quite as much. So I guess my question is, is there anything you think is notable for people to understand when it comes to translating that type of population stuff, or putting things into context within their own lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like Brad indicated, it's really important to use all the information accessible to you. So if there is high quality research evidence available, you probably want to make use of that, but you also don't want to assume that you or maybe your client that you're coaching is perfectly representative of the human population average that's been studied in that area, right? We should expect that some people have very different responses than others with a variety of different things. And frankly, with the vast majority of actionable decisions we have to make on a day-to-day basis, we don't have complete research information. We do have to fill in those gaps with other sources of information, our personal experience, our anecdotes, things of that nature, and kind of continuing to observe our own responses. So, yeah, I think evidence-based practice does not mean you ignore 20 years of lifting experience and say, well, crap, that has worked for me for 2 decades, but a new study came out, so now I'm screwed. It's like, well, one new study came out with 12, 20-year-old participants, and you're in your 40s and you've been doing this for 20 years. And so it's like, you're going to bail on something that's worked for 2 decades just because of this one little study that maybe it'll not even get replicated ever. You really do have to combine all these sources of information. And I do some stuff working with athletes and teams and stuff, and I never tell people, hey, forget everything you thought you knew about this sport because I'm going to come in with some data. It's like, no, that's crazy. You have to lean on that experience and that expertise and integrate it with the data. The only areas where you have to make some tough decisions is when there's actually very, very strong, very relevant data to what you're doing that says, hey, you gotta let this go, right? Because sometimes we can delude ourselves into thinking that something works when it doesn't, something is benign when it's harmful. Every now and then we do have to say, hey, this isn't the way to do it, and only when we have strong enough evidence to outweigh our perception of benefit.
Yeah. Feeding off of what you were talking about there with delusion, one thing I think about when it comes to this kind of N=1 idea is if you look at study results, especially smaller studies, a lot of times with the bigger studies or studies in general, they'll plot the average on the figures. But with some smaller studies, you'll see a bunch of dots, which are all the individual outcomes, and then you'll see the average. And what you'll see is, even though the average might be positive for whatever, there are always a couple people on the fringes that are outliers, that had the complete opposite outcome as the average would dictate. And it's just, I feel like with my own bias, my own experience, it's so easy to assume, oh, well, I'm just that one outlier. It's okay that the average says this because I fit into this box. But if you have everybody saying, oh, I'm this outlier, not everybody is the outlier by nature of it being an outlier.
Yeah. For most things in life, you probably are pretty average. And there will be some things for which you aren't, but that's just how averages work. And another important thing to keep in mind, and this is something that I think gets misinterpreted a lot in the fitness world, is when you're looking at that data and you say, okay, well, there's the mean, but look at these data points down here. We don't know in the vast majority of study designs why they're down there. We do not, we cannot say, hey, these people responded in a physiologically distinct way, and we now know the range to which they had, for example, muscle loss in a resistance training study. In reality, those weird, super low data points could be a combination of being somewhat poorer of a response, but it also could have some measurement error in the mix. It could have, like, they're that one participant who probably should have been kicked out of the study because they were like super stressed and maybe didn't eat during the study because they were worried about stuff all the time, and maybe just barely made enough workouts to not meet the criteria to be thrown out of the study and, excluded from the analysis. So all of that is to say, when you see a low value, like, there's a lot that can go into a low value that isn't necessarily a truly anomalous physiological response.
So my last question is going to be about advice for navigating kind of social media and health and fitness influencers versus actual researchers and medical doctors, and sometimes people check all of these boxes. I think a lot of what we've talked about today is useful information and some useful tools for kind of detecting whether or not somebody knows what they're talking about or whether or not they're kind of full of it. Do you have any other advice or specific advice for navigating health and fitness stuff on social media?
Yeah, I would say cross-reference stuff that's important to you. If you find that one person is kind of really way off from the pack and saying things that are kind of wacky, and they're not really willing to defend it in a meaningful way, you probably want to be wary of that. You want to make sure that you're following people who are informed, people who are honest, people who are willing to admit things that they don't know, and people who are eager to correct errors they've made in the past in terms of their information. You got to be very wary of the people who portray the most confidence in these areas, talking about new scientific findings, because the scientific process, whether you're doing it or reading it and staying up to date, is a process characterized by uncertainty. If we weren't uncertain, we wouldn't do it. That's literally the point. So when you see someone who makes content and everything they do is portrayed with 100% confidence and they've never been wrong somehow, even when they're making claims that outpace the research. And every time a study comes out, they say, see, I told you about this 10 years ago. You got to run, because there's just no one that good. And so what that tells you by process of elimination is that they're full of crap, and they're not willing to actually have the intellectual humility to tell you, I don't know, or I thought I knew and I was wrong. So I think that's the biggest thing is don't just read the content, but take a step back and assess the source in a very objective way and say, like, okay, does this person actually ever portray uncertainty? Do they ever say, hey, I used to teach this, but I got that a little bit wrong. New evidence came out. I was right based on the evidence at the time. That's fine to say. They could say, hey, I think I made the right decisions with the information I had, but new evidence came out, so therefore I changed. If you can't even get that out of them, it's probably not the person for you.
Cool. And before we wrap up, is there anywhere in particular people should go to find you? I know you're on all kinds of podcasts and all different stuff.
Yeah. Best places on Instagram. I'm at Trexler Fitness. A lot of my written work is at massresearchreview.com. Podcasting, I do the Iron Culture podcast. I'm a co-host of that and a co-host of Mass Office Hours, which are on YouTube and all the different platforms for podcasts. So not too hard to find. I'm out there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time to come on.
Yeah, of course.
All right, that wraps it up for my conversation with Dr. Trexler. I'll leave some links below to some places online where you can find him, as well as some links to some resistance training programs that I've written for anybody who's interested. With that, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.